The war ended. The flags came down. The crowds cheered in the streets of a dozen cities. But somewhere east of the Elbe, behind a line that had no name yet, American soldiers were still waiting. Not for rescue, not for transport. They were waiting for someone to admit they existed. General George S. Patton had spent 3 years moving faster than any army in history. Now he was being told to wait. The gates were closed, the Soviet officers were polite but immovable, and the men inside those camps were not German prisoners anymore. They were American soldiers trapped in a political silence that victory had created, not ended. If the war was truly over, why were these men still behind wire? By the spring of 1945, the momentum of the war in Europe belonged entirely to the Allied advance. Patton's Third Army had torn through France, driven into Germany, and pushed farther east than almost anyone in Washington had expected or, in some cases, wanted. The German military machine was disintegrating. Cities were surrendering. Entire divisions were laying down their weapons and walking toward American lines rather than face the advancing Soviet forces from the east. It should have been the cleanest moment of the war. A broken enemy, a clear victory, and the beginning of the long process of accounting for the dead, the wounded, and the captured. But the geography of collapse created a problem that no one in the planning rooms had fully prepared for. As the Third Reich fell apart, prisoner of war camps scattered across Central Europe and Eastern Germany were being overrun, not always by American forces but by Soviet ones. Thousands of American POWs, men who had survived years inside German camps, now found themselves in territory controlled by the Red Army. The formal agreement between the Allies, worked out at Yalta in February of that year, was supposed to provide for the orderly exchange and repatriation of liberated prisoners. Each side would care for the other's men. Each side would facilitate return. The agreement looked clean on paper. On the ground, it was becoming something else entirely. Patton was watching it happen in real time. He was not a man built for watching. The first signs that the exchange system was failing were not dramatic. There were no explosions, no overt confrontations. There was simply a growing gap between what the agreement promised and what was actually happening. Reports filtered into American command that Soviet-controlled camps holding liberated American POWs were not being opened on schedule. The exchange convoys that were supposed to bring American soldiers west were returning with fewer men than expected. Some returned with none. American liaison officers attempting to reach the camps were being delayed, redirected, or politely refused at checkpoints. Soviet officers on the ground cited administrative complications, confusion over prisoner locations, the chaos of the front's final days. Some of these explanations were probably true. The final weeks of the European war were genuinely chaotic. Supply lines were broken. Communication was unreliable. The sheer scale of displaced humanity moving across Central Europe in the spring of 1945 defied easy management. These were real conditions. They could explain delays. But they could not explain silence. They could not explain why American requests for specific information about specific men went unanswered for days, then weeks. They could not explain why Soviet officers, who were entirely cooperative on other matters, became suddenly vague when the conversation turned to the locations of American prisoner groups. And they could not explain why, when American officers did occasionally gain access to areas where men had reportedly been held, the men were gone, not dead, not moved to a known location, simply gone, in a way that left no clear trail for anyone following behind. Patton understood battlefield disorder. He had caused enough of it himself. But this was starting to feel different from disorder. This was starting to feel like a decision. And that was a problem that no tank could solve. The political architecture behind the prisoner exchange problem ran deeper than any single Soviet checkpoint or any single evasive officer. The Yalta Agreement of February 1945 had established a framework for mutual repatriation. On the surface, it was a reasonable document, a recognition that both sides held the other's men, and that the end of the war would require an organised transfer. The agreement called for the exchange to happen promptly, for liaison officers to have access, for the process to be transparent. In American reading, this meant a straightforward operation. Locate the men, transfer them, bring them home. But the Soviet interpretation of the agreement, as it was being applied on the ground, contained much more room for delay, condition, and control than the American architects of the deal had anticipated or acknowledged. Soviet officers operated inside a system where lateral communication with foreign military personnel required authorization from above, where authorization from above required patience, where patience, in practice, meant weeks. The tension was real, even if every exchange at every checkpoint remained technically civil. For Patton, the accumulation of delays was not an administrative inconvenience. It was an assault on the men under his responsibility. His understanding of military duty extended beyond the last moment of combat. The soldier who survived a German prison camp had survived on the promise, implied or spoken, that his own side would come for him. That promise did not expire at the ceasefire. Patton's known temperament, his absolute intolerance for anything that looked like an excuse standing between his soldiers and what they were owed, made the Soviet delays particularly combustible. But the list of names did not match the men being returned. That was the fact that kept resurfacing. Official Soviet counts did not correspond to American records of who had been captured and where. The discrepancies were not small. American officials who attempted to reconcile the numbers encountered bureaucratic resistance at every level. Requests for clarification produced counterquests. Requests for access produced procedural delays. The silence was becoming evidence. Not evidence of a single crime or a single decision, but evidence of something systemic. A pattern of non-disclosure that suggested the Soviet military, and possibly the Soviet political command, had reasons to keep the full picture of American prisoner locations obscured. What those reasons were remained unclear. The available record does not provide a clean answer. What it provides is the shape of an absence, the outline of men who should have appeared and did not, questions that were asked and not answered, and a commanding general whose patience with the entire situation was approaching its operational limit. Patton could move an army. He had demonstrated that conclusively, but he was not operating in a vacuum. His superior, General Dwight Eisenhower, was under intense political pressure to maintain the Soviet-American relationship through the final weeks of the war and into the occupation period. Stalin's cooperation was considered essential, not only for the European settlement, but for the Pacific, where Soviet entry into the war against Japan remained an American strategic priority. Disrupting the relationship over POW access, however morally justified Patton might have felt, was not the calculation Washington was making. That gap between Patton's moral accounting and Washington's political accounting was itself a kind of battlefield, and Patton was on the losing side of it before he made a single move. There is no single recorded confrontation between Patton and Soviet officers over the POW exchange that survives in clean, fully documented form. The historical record gives us the outcome, not every sentence spoken, but the weight of what is documented tells its own story. Patton pressed. He pressed through his staff. He pressed through official channels. He raised the prisoner question with intensity in internal communications and in conversations with American commanders around him. His frustration with the pace of repatriation was not a private feeling kept out of the command structure. It was an active, documented, and increasingly uncomfortable position for the men above him trying to manage Allied relations. The Soviet officers at the operational level were not acting from personal hostility. They were acting from instructions that reflected a broader Soviet institutional posture. Control information, manage access, do not allow foreign military personnel to operate freely inside Soviet-held territory, and resolve the prisoner question on Soviet terms and Soviet timelines. This posture had logic to it, from a Soviet strategic perspective. It also meant that men who were supposed to be going home were not going home. Patton did not wait well. That much is established beyond any reasonable historical doubt. His command style, documented across hundreds of records from the European campaign, was built on a nearly physical revulsion toward delay. Delay was waste. Delay was failure. Delay in a military sense was often death. When he encountered delay being used not as a battlefield condition but as a political instrument, the reaction was predictable, if not always expressible through official action. The answer from Soviet command was, in effect, no. Not a dramatic refusal, not a scene at a gate. The refusals came in the quieter form that bureaucratic obstruction always takes. Incomplete responses, missing documentation, access is denied for procedural reasons, exchange schedules that shifted without explanation, prisoner counts that never quite reconciled. The men were still missing. The war had ended on paper, not for them. What Patton could not do, given his position in the command structure and the political realities above him, was force the issue unilaterally. His known instinct was to push harder than the situation officially allowed. But the POW problem was not a battlefield problem. It could not be solved with speed, aggression, or the threat of firepower. It existed in the space between armies, inside the documents and the silences, and the political calculations of men in Moscow and Washington, who were already thinking past the war toward what came next. That was the confrontation Patton could not win. Not because he was wrong, but because the war he was fighting now was not the kind he had been built to fight. The question of American POWs in Soviet-controlled territory did not resolve cleanly with the war's end. In the months and years that followed, the accounting remained incomplete. The official position, maintained for decades, was that the repatriation process had been essentially successful, that the numbers reconciled, that the men had come home. Researchers and historians working through declassified documents in subsequent decades found reasons to question the completeness of that accounting. The precise number of American servicemen who may have remained in Soviet-controlled territory beyond the formal repatriation period, whether through Soviet decisions, bureaucratic failure, or deliberate retention, has never been established with certainty. The records that would answer the question definitively do not exist in accessible form, or do not exist at all. What is known is that the discrepancies Patton and others identified in 1945 were real, that the Soviet system of information control made full verification impossible at the time, and that the political pressure to declare the matter overwhelmed the pressure to pursue it further. Patton himself would be dead before the year was out, killed in a traffic accident in December 1945. He never had the opportunity to push the question beyond the occupation period, to whatever resolution it might have reached. His reputation as a political liability, a general who could not be trusted to stay inside the diplomatic lines that post-war Europe required, had already made him a problem for the command structure before the accident that ended his life. The Cold War that began almost immediately after the European War institutionalized the silence Patton had found so intolerable. The Soviet Union and the United States became adversaries across a line that made the movement of information, let alone people, nearly impossible to force. The men who had not come home became a closed chapter. What this story reveals is not simply a clash between one general and a foreign military structure. It reveals something about the relationship between war and accountability, about who gets to decide when a conflict is finished and which questions are allowed to remain open. Victory in 1945 was real. The defeat of Nazi Germany was one of the genuinely necessary accomplishments of the 20th century. Nothing in this story diminishes that. But victory is not the same as completion. A war ends in the official sense when the documents are signed and the guns go quiet. It ends in the human sense only when every person who entered it has been accounted for, when the living have come home, when the dead have been named, when the missing have been searched for, with the same urgency that was once spent fighting. Patton understood, in his blunt and imperfect way, that the bureaucratic management of a prisoner exchange was not an administrative problem. It was a moral one. The men in those camps had done what was asked of them. They had entered the machine of the war and survived it. The obligation to bring them back did not end because the political situation had become inconvenient. The last enemy of war is not always the soldier holding a gun. Sometimes it is the official holding a file closed. Patton's final war was not against Germany. It was against the idea that powerful men, once they have declared victory, are no longer required to answer for the human cost of achieving it. He lost that war. But the question he was asking has not gone away. It never does. It simply waits, patient and persistent, for someone with the will to ask it again.